Hey everyone, my name is Charlie and today I would like to talk about the books that I read in December 2014. Over the last year, I have been going over the books that I read a decade ago to see whether I remember any of them, whether I can share a few anecdotes, whether any of them became new favourites. And it's been a good one for me to look at because I'm able to recognise how much my reading has changed, my reading habits have changed. This was a year in which I had been working on a middle grade book for a long time, and so I was trying to read a lot from that genre, but also I was discovering what sort of things I wanted to read, and I wanted to get into more graphic novels. They were very popular on YouTube at the time, but it was a specific type of graphic novel. There was a lot of lumberjanes and that sort of thing going on, which isn't a problem. I still haven't read that myself, but I had to go with what my library had, and I wanted to expand my reading in that direction. And I was also just, I think, beginning to recognise more of who I was going to become as a reader. Anyway, the first book that I finished in December 2014 was Sleeping Murder by Agatha Christie. This was the final novel to feature Miss Marple, and I recall it being something of a disappointment. If I remember rightly, Agatha Christie wrote this during the war as an air of finality for the Miss Marple series should she not live through the war. I believe it had a few continuity errors from what I do recall. Otherwise, I don't know much about this one. There are some Agatha Christie's that stick in my mind because I've seen them adapted, I've read them more than once, or I've heard them on the radio. There are stories there that have just stuck with me. This one hasn't. Five Little Pigs, my favourite Agatha Christie, featuring Poirot, stuck with me. Sleeping Murder, could not tell you a thing about it other than the title and what I believe was the case of its origin. Then I read The One and Only Ivan. I cannot remember this book. I believe it is about a gorilla. I believe there is mention of a circus in there. I should also state that during this video, should you hear my dog barking, there is nothing I can do about it. There are workmen outside and she will not be quelled. Other than that, I don't remember much about The One and Only Ivan, other than it was recommended to me by a friend who I'd gone to for middle grade recommendations, and it's something that I've continued to do. They rather enjoy middle grade fiction and are always a great person to go to for these recommendations, especially when I was working on that book. And I do think that I rather enjoyed the book at the time. Had I still got it around, maybe it's something that I'd like to revisit, but this was also the time in which, as I say, my tastes were changing, and therefore some of the books didn't stick around. Some of them I thought were fantastic, but I was never going to read again. They didn't suit the sensibilities. I hadn't yet found what I liked when it came to middle grade fiction. You know, those books aren't primarily written for adults, and I think there's a sense of nostalgia when an adult reads a book for this target market, and The One and Only Ivan just is one that I thought was great, but I don't recall. And then I spent the remainder of the year reading the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th and spin-off books to a series that was popular when I was a child and featured a young wizard. I said that this was going to be a difficult one for me to talk about because back in 2020 certain events occurred that made me decide that I wasn't going to mention this author on this platform again. Now, some of my videos where I've mentioned them before are still on this channel, and there's nothing I could do about that because it would mean going back through quite a lot. All I will say is that I had reached a point during this year where I recognised that my reading was just taking a downturn, and I recognised I was feeling a certain type of way. Therefore, I chose to go back to books that I had a lot of nostalgia for and I very much enjoyed. The 4th book in this series had been my favourite of the series for the longest time. Also, it has now been 10 years since I finished reading this series and never went back to it. I used to read all of these books twice a year. I'd read them once in the summer and once at Christmas. And it would be a case in my family of people walking past and say, "Oh, you're not reading that again. Surely you've got something else on your shelves." And I did, but it wasn't just nostalgia for me. If you watched my video with Charlie, there was a sense of connection to a lost relative when I read these books, but there was also a magic and a whimsy there that I had always navigated towards. I have to say, as I grew older past this, there were occasions when I would pick up a book again and think, oh, I can't believe I didn't read it this year, which I think was the case in 2015, where I was going to try and cram to read all of them in. And it was a difficult time towards the end of that year, which meant it didn't happen. And there was so much more to read. As I reached a certain age, I thought, maybe it's okay to leave those books back in childhood. And so I think that's been what's happened to them. They have been forced into a kind of filing cabinet in my mind that I don't consider often, because I think they became a bit synonymous with grief for me. And I think that I'd reached a point in life where I was holding on to the grief a bit too much, and honestly not reading them did almost feel like a bit of a relief to say goodbye to those books and recognise that there is a lot more fiction out there, and there is a lot more I enjoy in fiction than 7 particular books by a person who I no longer agree with and would never be inclined to wish to meet. And so that was really how I thought I would be seeing 2014 out. But that left me at 109 books, and I didn't like that number. So I chose to read another graphic novel, which was Dungeon Zenith Volume 1, Duck Heart by Joann Sfar. This is a riff on Dungeons and Dragons that apparently influenced Adventure Time. I've seen a few episodes of that and I can see where that came from, but I never went further reading the Dungeon series. This was a year that I was really invested in Joann Sfar's career, and I wanted to read more and more by the writer. And one day I think I'm definitely going to, although it has been 10 years since I read this first book, because it's still on my shelf, to go back and read this entire series. It's just, it became a bit complicated and I didn't know whether I'd be able to get all of them in English and all of that fun stuff. But Joann Sfar in 2014 proved to become a writer I would go on to recommend and whose career I followed. And it was a great way to end the year, really. I think that I was looking at it as a way to embrace new authors and start this whole thing of returning to authors that I'd long neglected. And so I was glad to have ended the year with that book, because this person did go on to become a favourite. And then when I look ahead at 2015, I still hadn't got back to reading a lot, but I know how things went in 2015. That was a big year of change for me in different ways. And I was going to ask you that question. Over the next year, do you want me to look at the books that I read in 2015 to bring us up to date? And then every book I've read over the last 10 years would have been mentioned on this channel, because I started in August 2015. Or shall I leave this series to die in the dust? Do I continue looking back, or do we continue to just look forward? Let me know in the comments, and let me know how you get on with discussing books by people whose opinions you no longer value. Is that a good way of putting it? I don't know. I don't particularly care either, but we've reached the end of 2014. There were 110 books, and I could not tell you the ones that I remembered and the ones that I no longer think about. Or, you know, like, if I went back and watched January's video from this, I'm pretty sure that I would not remember those books still. It's just who I am. I have a poor memory in my old age. If anyone remembers the plot to The One and Only Ivan and would like to tell me what it is in the comments, then please feel free to do so. I hope that you have enjoyed this video, enjoyed this entire series of videos on my channel, and if you haven't, well, you're the one who sat through them. Because until next time, that is all.